I spent the summer guiding fishing expeditions out of a small riverside camp. Aside from my own crude cabin, the only other dwelling nearby belonged to Dale, a reclusive trapper nobody in the village seemed to like discussing. They called him Old Dale, but no one really knew how old he was. Some claimed he'd never left the bush in 30 years. Others whispered he was once a normal man, driven mad by an Arctic winter that froze half his face. With curiosity gnawing at me, I decided to visit him. One gray afternoon, I hiked 5 miles through dense spruce, following a faint trail. Dale's shack stood in a clearing littered with animal bones. Antlers, ribs, and skulls adorned the front porch like grotesque trophies. The stench of decay hung thick in the humid summer air. A battered sled leaned against the cabin wall, caked in dried blood. My instincts told me to turn back, but I ignored them. The door was slightly ajar. I knocked. No answer. A wave of metallic odor, like rusted iron, drifted out. My stomach flipped. Slowly, I pushed the door open. A suspended fox carcass greeted me, half flayed, entrails dangling onto newspapers. Flies buzzed in a halo around the corpse, feasting on the dripping fluids. Wooden countertops were strewn with tools, knives, scalpels, bent saws. Most had brownish-red residue on the blades. Buckets lined the walls, each containing lumps of unrecognizable raw tissue. The floor was stained so dark in places that it looked lacquered with old blood. My eyes locked on a small table in the corner, where a row of Polaroid photos pinned to the wall depicted Dale posing with gutted wolves, beavers, and then something that made my heart hammer. An arm, clearly human, severed at the elbow, displayed like a prize. The overhead light bulb flickered, revealing a notebook full of meticulous notes on skinning techniques, dotted with references to two-legged game. A shuffle behind me made me spin around. Dale stood there, a wiry man with tangled hair and a beard stiff with dried gore. He wore ragged furs that reeked so powerfully I nearly retched. His eyes were wild, shining with a twisted hunger. His voice cracked. "Another lost one, are ya?" He lifted a long-bladed hunting knife, its tip glinting in the dim light. I stammered a greeting, hands trembling. He stepped closer, grin widening to show blackened teeth. I scrambled backward, knocking over a bucket of fresh organs, perhaps from some unlucky bear, or, God forbid, a person. Its contents splattered across my boots, the coppery reek overwhelming. Dale lunged, slashing the air. I dodged, feeling hot breath on my neck. Somehow, I bolted past him, shoving aside a bloody table. My boots slipped in a slick of entrails, nearly sending me crashing. He growled behind me, blade scraping the wooden floor. I tore through the open doorway and into the yard, heart drumming a furious rhythm. The forest seemed eerily silent as I sprinted among the pines, half expecting to feel the knife bury into my back. When I glanced over my shoulder, I caught one last glimpse of Dale, standing on his porch, knife in hand, not giving chase, just watching. It was as though the thrill of the hunt mattered more than the kill itself. Or maybe he knew I could lead others to him, and that fear alone would keep me silent. I packed my bags and left the region at dawn. I never reported him to the authorities. I rationalized that no law enforcement was likely to trek that deep without cause. Maybe I was a coward, but I still see that shack in my nightmares. Flayed animals, a severed human arm, and Dale's frenzied grin. Out there in the Alaskan wild, I witnessed a monster who wore the skin of a man. Working the graveyard shift as a security guard is dull, until it isn't. In the case of St. Mercy Hospital, it became a place of terror I still can't fully process. My nightly rounds included a dingy sub-basement, a leftover from decades-old expansions, rumored to have once treated TB patients under dire circumstances. It was 2:45 a.m. on a Thursday when I descended the cracked stairs. My flashlight flickered, highlighting the chipped paint and exposed pipes overhead. A sour smell intensified as I neared the bottom. The corridor was mostly silent, except for the hum of old fluorescent lights. At the far end was a trio of doors marked with peeling letters. 2 were locked. The third, Operating Room C, hung ajar. My job demanded I investigate. Pushing it wider, I stepped into a stale operating theater. Dim overhead fixtures buzzed, revealing counters piled with dusty surgical equipment, rusty clamps, scalpels, syringes. The tile floor bore wide, dried stains in deep maroon. My adrenaline spiked when I realized they weren't stains from decades ago. Some areas glistened, wet, fresh. A pungent wave of iron stench struck me. I saw a metal gurney in the center of the room, straps dangling. The straps and gurney edges were smeared in something dark and thick, with a texture that reminded me of half-clotted blood. On the floor beneath, lumps of raw tissue shimmered under fluorescent glare. I kneeled, nauseous, to confirm my worst suspicion. They were chunks of flesh, large enough to suggest they came from a person's torso. A sudden clang came from behind a divider screen. My heart pounded in my ears. Footsteps, the slow scrape of a shoe on tile, echoed in the gloom. Flicking my flashlight over the screen, I glimpsed a figure in a dirty surgeon's coat. Blood saturated the fabric, streaking down to the floor. Its face was partially hidden by a mask crusted with gore, revealing only wide, glassy eyes. We locked gazes for a fraction of a second. Then it moved, jerking forward, brandishing what looked like a bone saw. The whirring sound was low and menacing. I stumbled, stepping on a severed finger that rolled underfoot. Panic seized me. I turned to run, boot soles skidding on the slick floor. Behind me, I heard more footsteps, multiple sets, accompanied by inhuman murmurs. There had to be at least 2 or 3 of these surgeons, or whatever they were. The overhead lights flickered, and a chorus of raspy breathing filled the corridor as I sprinted toward the exit. In the fleeting seconds before I escaped, I glimpsed shapes pressed against the hallway walls, like silhouettes slinking back into doorways. My mind screamed to keep moving. Reaching the locked stairwell, I crashed through. I never bothered with the elevator. I tore through the main lobby, ignoring the startled look of a nurse at the front desk. By morning, I typed my resignation. When I explained to the supervisor what I saw, they brushed it off as night shift delirium. The hospital never investigated, or if they did, no one told me. But I know what lurks there. Some hidden group in that defunct sub-basement, practicing monstrous acts with surgical precision. Every so often, in my sleep, I see that operating table awash in fresh gore, and I hear the scrape of footsteps behind me. That place remains sealed under layers of official denial. If you ask me, not even a wrecking ball could rid it of the horrors that dwell within. I was on day 2 of a non-stop drive from Texas to California, running on gas station coffee and adrenaline. Around midnight, I spotted a solitary sign, glowing pink. Desert View Motel. Exhaustion outweighed my reservations about its ragged appearance. I swung into the pothole-riddled lot, parked, and shuffled into the lobby, where a sickly-looking clerk handed me a key for room 107 without meeting my gaze. My room reeked of stale cigarettes and a faint, sour undertone. The mattress creaked as I collapsed onto it, not even bothering to undress. Sleep came quick, but it didn't last. A scratching sound awakened me. At first, I assumed it was roaches scuttling in the walls, but the noise was heavier, like claws scraping on concrete. Grabbing my phone for light, I scanned the floor. Nothing. Then came a knock, soft, insistent, on the door. The clock read 3:06 a.m. My gut churned with dread. Through the peephole, I saw a black shape pressed against the glass, hunched and contorted. A wet scraping sound accompanied it, like raw meat dragging on pavement. Summoning courage, I opened the door a crack. The hallway's lone flickering bulb illuminated a horrifying scene. A stray dog's torn carcass sprawled on the cement walkway, guts splayed out, glistening. Over it crouched a lanky figure, pale limbs bent at unnatural angles, hair an oily tangle. It gnawed on the dog's intestines, ripping them free with a low, guttural snarl. Blood sprayed across the motel's chipped paint. My breath locked in my throat. The creature snapped its head up, black eyes glinting. Its jaw hung open wider than any human's could, revealing rows of stained teeth. I slammed the door, heart hammering. Behind me, something stirred under the bed. A loud rasping noise followed, a hiss or a ragged breath. My phone flashlight caught an elongated arm sliding out from beneath the box spring, nails scrabbling. Panicked, I fumbled for the light switch. The overhead lamp flickered, revealing a second twisted figure lurking halfway out from under the bed, limbs too long, skin sallow and stretched tight over bone. Its eyes were vacant hollows, but it sensed me, snapping its jaw, as if biting at the air. I could smell rotting flesh and something bitter, like bile. My survival instincts roared. I darted for the door again, crossing the threshold into the corridor. The dog's remains crunched under my shoes, and the first creature lurched to its feet. It scurried backward, spider-like, flattening itself against the wall. I bolted down the walkway, passing door after door. Some were open, revealing dark rooms. In the corner of my vision, I spotted shapes sliding along the motel's exterior, crawling across broken windows and flickering lights. The entire place seemed infested with these things, as though they'd made it their nesting ground. Diving into my car, I locked the doors. In the rearview mirror, silhouettes streaked through the gloom. Claws scraped the trunk, leaving deep gouges in the paint. I revved the engine and peeled out of the lot, headlights illuminating half a dozen contorted figures shrieking at me. A cacophony of shrill wails that rang in my ears long after I was miles away. I reached the next town and parked at a 24-hour diner, shaking uncontrollably. Dawn broke, coloring the sky in soft pink, a harsh contrast to the nightmare I'd fled. Later, I tried to retrace my route. No sign of the motel. My GPS claimed there was nothing but desert for 100 miles. To this day, I have gouges on my car's trunk, a stark reminder of that night's horror, and the memory of cracked jaws tearing into fresh entrails. My grandfather was a handyman, always building or fixing something in his workshop. After he died, I inherited the property. I thought it'd be a peaceful place to spend my weekends. Then I started organizing Grandpa's tools, sorting through old crates. That's when I discovered a hidden door behind stacked lumber, marked with a faded sign. Quiet room, no entry. Curiosity prevailed. I pried the door open, nearly choking on the fetid smell that rushed out. The room was cramped, lit only by a dangling bulb that sputtered weakly. Blood-stained shackles were bolted to the walls. A steel table with rusted chains lay in the center, its surface marred by deep grooves that could only be from frantic scratching. Dried, dark splatters covered the concrete floor, forming grotesque patterns. A battered trunk sat in the corner. Its lock had snapped, and the lid was partially raised. Inside, I saw soiled rags, a half-rotted rope, and disturbingly, a collection of bones wrapped in frayed cloth. Some were small, possibly human. My stomach lurched as a stench of decay hit me full force. On a makeshift shelf, Polaroids and old Polavision film reels told a story of grim torment. In one series of photos, a man resembling my grandfather stood beside a figure strapped to the steel table, limbs contorted in pain. The victim's face was a mask of utter terror. Another photo depicted him, dissecting someone's forearm with a hacksaw. The flesh peeled back, revealing raw muscle and bone. I reeled in disbelief. This kind, jovial old man who taught me to fix cars and whittle wood had led a secret life as a predator. My brain scrambled for explanations. Maybe these were staged. Maybe Grandpa was forced. But the evidence was too visceral. A soft creak echoed from the workshop. My adrenaline surged. Were these horrors truly locked in the past? Or was someone, still there? I stepped outside the quiet room, scanning the shadows. My flashlight revealed fresh footprints in the sawdust, leading toward an old cabinet. I yanked the door open, half expecting a living captive. It was empty. Suddenly, the overhead light flickered, and a faint shuffle came from behind me. I whirled around. No one there. My heart throbbed in my throat. It was as if the building itself breathed malevolence, hungry for more suffering. I fled to my truck and called the local authorities. They conducted a half-hearted investigation. Small-town politics might have shielded Grandpa's memory. Or maybe they found the truth too horrifying to confront. The official story was that Grandpa was an eccentric collector of crime scene paraphernalia. But I saw the Polaroids, the shackles fitted to that steel table, and the bloody scrawl etched into the concrete. Help me. I sold the property. Some nights, I dream I'm locked in that quiet room, hearing a soft drip of blood and faint screams behind the walls. Waking up, I can still feel the shackles on my wrists. Grandpa taught me many lessons in life, just not how to unsee the atrocities he committed. My friends and I called ourselves urban spelunkers, exploring abandoned malls, factories, and theme parks. Our holy grail was Kingside Fun Park, a once thriving amusement center closed since the late 90s. Locals whispered about missing pets and strange sightings near the property. We dismissed it as superstition until we entered. We hopped a rusted fence one humid night. The vacant rides, roller coasters, a Ferris wheel, loomed like skeletons. Everything was encrusted in years of grime. We found a locked service hatch near the bumper car pavilion, pried it open, and descended into the rumored tunnels. The air grew stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something else. Rotting flesh. Corridors branched in multiple directions. Our flashlights illuminated graffiti and a tangle of pipes overhead. After about 5 minutes, we stumbled into a large, open chamber. The reek was overwhelming, like an abattoir left to fester. Strewn about were the rotting remains of animals, raccoons, coyotes, even deer. Some displayed fresh wounds, half consumed, organs exposed. Flies buzzed in a frenzy. My friend Lydia gagged, and another friend, Marcus, swore under his breath. In the far corner stood a wire cage. I nearly dropped my flashlight when I saw what it contained. A hunched humanoid figure with patchy skin, its limbs contorted at unnatural angles. Filthy nails scratched at the bars. It glared at us with milky eyes, emitting a guttural hiss. Raw flesh clung to its chin, evidence of a recent feeding. Before we could process the scene, a thunderous crash reverberated from a side passage. The shrieking echoed, accompanied by frantic scraping, like claws on concrete. We realized there might be more than one. Panicked, we turned to run back, but the door we'd come through slammed shut. Footsteps thundered behind it, and an inhuman growl ricocheted off the walls. Frenzied, we fled down a different corridor. Dim emergency lights flickered to life, revealing tattered carnival posters and rust-colored splatters on the floor. The moans of other caged creatures drifted through vents. The stench of waste and decay intensified, burning our nostrils. Something scuttled across the ceiling, a pale shape with elongated arms, nails digging into the concrete. Its head whipped around, locking onto us with bulging eyes. It dropped onto the floor with a sickening crunch, landing in a crouch, and let out a rasping wail. We scattered, nearly falling over each other in terror. I sprinted around a corner and found a rusted ladder leading up to another hatch. Adrenaline roared in my veins as I climbed. Below, the creature lunged at Marcus, slicing into his arm. Blood spurted, splattering the ground. He howled in pain, kicking it away. Lydia and I pulled him up the ladder, ignoring his screams. The hatch resisted at first, but with a combined shove it burst open, fresh night air flooding in. We spilled onto the surface near the Ferris wheel, battered and horrified. Behind us, shrieks echoed from the hatch. More shapes emerged, eyes glowing in the darkness. We didn't look back. We tore through the overgrown park, vaulted the fence, and collapsed onto the roadside. Marcus needed stitches, but we couldn't explain the wounds without sounding insane. Days later, rumors spread that the city planned to demolish the park, filling in the tunnels. Part of me wonders what they'll find in those depths. Maybe the feral beings will vanish deeper underground, or maybe they'll lash out when threatened. I haven't returned. None of us have. Yet I still wake up nights drenched in sweat, hearing those shrill howls and picturing that caged creature gnawing on fresh carcasses.